The voicemail arrived while I was elbow-deep in a merger filing that had kept me at the office until midnight 3 days in a row. My paralegal's voice was careful, measured the tone people use when they're trying not to alarm you. "Carter, I think you need to call me back. It's about the safety deposit box. Someone came in today. With your mother." I set down my pen, not because I was afraid, because I had been expecting exactly this sentence for 11 months. I could picture him standing in the lobby of Meridian Bank on 5th, one hand resting on my mother's lower back, that proprietary touch he'd perfected, smiling at the teller like a man who already owned the room. He thought showing up with her was enough. He thought a marriage license was a master key. He had no idea I'd been 3 steps ahead of him since the day he first asked my mother what my father's estate was worth. I have never told my mother what my father left inside that safety deposit box. Not when he was alive, not in the months after he died, and not after she married Dennis. Some people might call that cruelty. I call it the most careful act of love I have ever performed. My father was an estate attorney for 31 years. He spent his career watching families destroy themselves over money, over misunderstandings, over documents signed in grief that could never be unsigned. He used to say that the most dangerous moment in any family's life was the 12 months after a loss. People are raw, he said. They reach for warmth and sometimes grab fire by mistake. When he got his diagnosis pancreatic, stage 3, the kind that doesn't negotiate, he didn't panic. He planned. That was who he was. He called me into his study one evening in October, poured 2 glasses of his good bourbon, and told me exactly what he needed me to do. "There's a box," he said, "at Meridian. You're the only authorized name besides mine. Your mother is not on it, and I need you to understand why." He wasn't excluding her out of distrust. He was protecting her from herself. "She's going to grieve," he said quietly, "and when people grieve, they're vulnerable. I need you to hold this until she's on the other side of it, until she can see clearly again." I asked him what was inside. He smiled. "The whole picture," he said. "Not just the numbers." He died the following March. The box stayed untouched. My mother moved through the first year the way people do when the life they built around another person suddenly disappears, slowly, cautiously, like someone learning to walk again after a long illness. She sold the large house they'd shared, moved into the condominium on Sycamore that she'd always loved but my father thought was too small. She had lunch with her friends again. She started sleeping through the night. I thought she was going to be fine. Then she met Dennis at a charity gala hosted by the Hospital Foundation, where she volunteered every Tuesday afternoon. He was 62, recently widowed, wore good suits, and spoke the language of comfortable people fluently. He talked about his late wife with just enough sadness to seem sincere, and just enough distance to seem available. He brought my mother flowers that weren't roses. "Roses are too obvious," he told her, laughing, and took her to restaurants where the menus had no prices. When I met him for the first time, at a dinner my mother arranged with the careful hopefulness of someone presenting something fragile, he shook my hand and said, "Your father was a brilliant man, a real architect of legacy." It wasn't a compliment. It was reconnaissance. The questions came gradually. How large was the estate? Had everything cleared probate smoothly? Was I still managing my mother's accounts, or had she moved to a financial advisor? He asked these things lightly, conversationally, the way you'd ask someone about the weather as if the answers were too small to matter. They were not too small. He was mapping. I noticed that he always asked financial questions in front of my mother, never alone. This was intentional. It made refusal look like rudeness. It made my caution look like hostility. When I answered vaguely, "Everything's well managed, thank you," he'd smile and say something generous, and my mother would glance at me with a look that said, "He's just making conversation. Why are you like this?" I didn't argue with that look. I documented it. I kept a private file, the same way my father had taught me to document anything that might matter later. Dates, exact phrasing, the subjects he circled back to, and when. I noted the first time he asked about the safety deposit box by name, not your father's things or the estate paperwork, but the box at Meridian, as if he'd already done his research and simply needed confirmation. That was 7 months into their relationship. 2 months later, they were engaged. 4 months after that, married in a small ceremony at the botanical garden that I attended with a smile I had rehearsed. My mother was happy. That was real, and I held on to it. But happiness and safety are not always the same room. After the wedding, Dennis moved into the condominium on Sycamore. I watched the small shifts. The way my mother stopped mentioning her accountant's name and started saying, "Dennis handles most of that now." The way she'd call me and lower her voice slightly before sharing anything financial. Not because she was hiding it, but because she'd learned, unconsciously, that Dennis preferred to be the one who shared information. The way she started saying, "we," about decisions that used to be "I." None of it was dramatic. That was the point. Isolation done well looks like partnership from the outside. I started receiving my mother's calls at odd hours, early morning, late evening, the edges of the day when Dennis was presumably elsewhere. She never acknowledged this pattern. I didn't either, but I listened carefully to everything she didn't say. 8 months into the marriage, she mentioned that Dennis had suggested they visit Meridian Bank together to get everything organized in one place. She said it the way people say something they've been asked to deliver, not something they arrived at themselves. There was a small hesitation before organized that told me she'd used his word, not hers. I told her I'd handle the box. My father had asked me to. "Dennis thinks it would just be simpler," she said gently. "I'm sure he does," I replied. The silence that followed was the first real one we'd had since the wedding. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Janet at Meridian. She'd worked there for 22 years and had known my father since before I was born. Her voice was careful. "Someone came in today with your mother." He asked to access the box under spousal rights. I asked what she'd told him. That the box has a sole authorized user, and that authorization doesn't transfer through marriage. He wasn't happy. I thanked her. I added the date and exact wording to my file. Then I called my attorney. "He's going to escalate," she told me. "Men like this always do when the polite approach fails. He'll go one of 2 ways, legal pressure or emotional pressure. Probably both." She was right about the timeline, if not the sequence. He started with emotional. My mother called me 3 days later, and I could hear in the first syllable that she was delivering a script she'd been handed. "Dennis says you've been difficult with the bank, that you've put restrictions on accounts that should be accessible to the family." I asked her what accounts she meant. "He says, you know which ones." "Mom," I said evenly, "Dad asked me to manage the box. I'm managing it, that's all. He's my husband," she said. "He should be able to help." "Help with what, specifically?" The pause stretched. "He thinks there might be documents in there that affect our finances. Things that should be in both our names." There it was. He'd gotten her to say it for him. He'd framed my father's careful planning as a problem to be fixed, an inconvenience to be corrected, an old man's paperwork that needed updating to reflect the new reality he'd installed himself into. I kept my voice steady. "Mom, I'll come home next weekend. We'll talk in person." She hesitated. "Dennis will be here." "I know," I said. I booked my flight that night. On the plane, I thought about my father, about the way he used to sit at his desk on Sunday mornings, reading through documents with a yellow legal pad beside him, annotating everything. He believed that most legal disasters were really failures of clarity, not malice, not fraud, just things left ambiguous long enough for the wrong person to fill in the blank. He had not left anything ambiguous. I landed on a Saturday morning and went straight to Meridian before driving to my mother's. Janet met me in the private room off the main lobby with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been expecting me. The box was exactly as my father had left it. I'd been inside it once, the week after he died, alone, when the grief was still the kind that makes you careful rather than careless. I'd read everything then without fully understanding it. Now I read it again with 11 months of Dennis behind me, and every page landed differently. The first document was the trust. A revocable living trust my father had established 12 years earlier and updated 6 months before he died. It was structured around my mother's lifetime needs. The condominium was hers, unconditionally. A monthly income was guaranteed from the investment accounts. Her medical and long-term care expenses were fully covered. She would never be in need. But the trust also contained a specific clause, one my father had added in that final revision, written in the plain language he always preferred over legal complexity. Any assets held within the trust were explicitly excluded from the marital estate of any future spouse. They could not be commingled, transferred, leveraged, or claimed. A new marriage did not change the architecture. My mother had full use and benefit of everything. But nothing could be redirected without a process that would require court approval, a guardian ad litem, and my signature. Dennis had been fishing in a locked pond. The second document was a letter of instruction my father had written to me. Not sentimental, he saved sentiment for the next envelope, but practical. It outlined what he'd noticed in the years before his diagnosis. A pattern in people who came to him as clients. Spouses who entered grieving households and gradually repositioned themselves as the managing partner of everything financial. He'd seen it professionally dozens of times. He had taken steps to ensure it couldn't happen to my mother. "You may feel guilty for knowing," he wrote. "Don't. Information held in patience is not a secret. It's a shield." The third document was the one I hadn't been ready to read the first time. It was a letter addressed to my mother. My father had written it in the last weeks of his life, when he was still clear but tired, when the handwriting was slightly looser than his usual precision. He wrote about their marriage 34 years, the house in Millbrook, the early lean years when they ate spaghetti 4 nights a week because it was all they could afford, and it was somehow the happiest period of his life. He wrote about her laugh. He wrote about the way she still reached for his hand in movie theaters even after 3 decades. Then he wrote about what he needed her to know if she ever found herself in a moment of confusion about what was hers. "Everything I built for you," he wrote. "Not to control you, to free you. You don't owe anyone access to what I leave behind. Not grief, not loneliness, not a ring on your finger. What belongs to you, and I have made sure the paperwork says so. If someone tells you otherwise, they are wrong, and if someone pressures you to believe otherwise, they are not who they say they are." I sat in that private room for a long time. Then I photographed everything, placed the documents back in the exact order my father had arranged them, locked the box, and drove to Sycamore. Dennis opened the door. He smiled with the practiced ease of a man who has decided to be charming for now. "She's in the kitchen," he said, stepping back to let me in. "We were just having coffee. Join us." The kitchen felt smaller than I remembered. My mother stood at the counter, and the relief on her face when she saw me was complicated, warm but watchful, like she'd been waiting to see which version of this conversation I'd arrived to have. Dennis sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table. He had the posture of a man conducting a meeting he believed he'd already won. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "There's been some confusion about the accounts, and I think if we all just talk openly—" "There's no confusion," I said. He paused. The smile stayed, but something behind it recalibrated. "I only meant—" "You went to Meridian Bank," I said. "With my mother. You attempted to access a safety deposit box that is solely in my name. The bank declined you." My mother set down her coffee cup. "I was trying to help organize. You told the teller you had spousal rights to the contents," I said. "That's not organizing. That's a legal claim." He leaned back. The charm shifted into something cooler. "I'm her husband. Anything affecting her financial security affects me." "Her financial security is fully protected," I said, "by a trust my father established years ago. Nothing in that trust is accessible to a spouse. Not by request, not by pressure, not by marriage license." Silence. My mother looked at Dennis. "You told me the estate hadn't been fully settled." He turned to her smoothly. "I said it might be worth reviewing, to make sure everything was in order." "It's been in order for 12 years, I said. "He just didn't know that yet." Dennis looked at me with something that wasn't quite anger, more like the recalculation of someone who's realized the board is different than they thought. "You're making me sound like a criminal." "I'm stating facts," I said. "The fact is that you've been asking about my father's estate since before you and my mother were engaged. The fact is that you attempted bank access you were not authorized for. The fact is that my mother's finances are structured in a way that specifically prevents what you've been trying to do." "That's an accusation," he said tightly. "It's documentation," I replied. I reached into my bag and placed a single folder on the table. Inside was a printed summary, not the full trust documents. Those were safely photographed and backed up in 3 locations, but a clear, plain language overview of the structure my father had built. What was protected, what could not be transferred, what my mother's rights were, and what they were not. And behind that, printed copies of the text messages, the emails, the logged calls, 11 months of careful observation, dated and sourced. Dennis looked at the folder without touching it. My mother picked it up. She read slowly, the way she read anything important with full attention, moving her lips slightly on the sentences that mattered. I watched her face as she moved through the trust summary and understood for the first time what her financial life actually looked like. Watched her eyes change when she reached the clause about spousal exclusion. Watched her pause on the date of the last amendment 6 months before my father died and understand what it meant that he'd updated it then. She set the papers down carefully. "You told me there were questions about the estate," she said to Dennis. Her voice was quiet. That particular quiet that comes not from softness but from the complete absence of performance. "You told me my daughter was making things complicated." "She is. She's been protecting me." Dennis shifted. "You don't have the full picture." "I have the folder," my mother said simply. She stood up, smoothed her blouse, and looked at him with the clear eyes of someone who has just finished a very long sentence and finally put down the period. "I'd like you to go stay at the Marriott on Clement tonight," she said. "I need to read these documents properly." "Alone." He opened his mouth. She didn't wait for what came out of it. "Dennis." One word. He went. After I heard the front door close, the kitchen felt like it exhaled. My mother sat back down across from me and pushed the folder aside to make room for her coffee cup. She wrapped both hands around it the way she used to when I was small, and she was reading at the kitchen table, and I'd come in early on Saturday mornings. "How long have you known?" she asked. "That he was after the money?" Since about the 4th conversation, she nodded slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" This was the question I'd rehearsed. The honest answer was, "Because you wouldn't have believed me." But the truer answer was the one my father had written. "Because the truth has to arrive in the right order," I said. "Otherwise, it gets rejected before it lands." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car pulled away from the curb. "Your father wrote me a letter," I said. "It's in the box. You can read it whenever you're ready. I won't rush you." She looked up. "Did you read it? What does it say?" I thought about 34 years of spaghetti dinners and movie theaters, and a man who spent his last months making sure his wife would never be vulnerable to the wrong kind of hand reaching for hers. "It says everything you already know," I told her, "about what you deserve, and why he made sure the paperwork agreed." She pressed her lips together, nodded once, the way she does when she's decided something. "I'm going to need a good divorce attorney," she said. "I know one," I replied. She almost smiled. "Of course you do." We sat there for a while without speaking, the coffee going cool between us, the folder on the table looking smaller than everything it had required to assemble. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor in the slow way it does in late autumn, unhurried, certain of itself. My mother reached across and put her hand over mine. "I'm sorry I made you carry this alone," she said. "You didn't know you were doing it," I said. "That's how it works." "Still, Dad asked me to hold it until you were ready." I held it. She squeezed my hand once and let go. Then she reached for the folder again and opened it to the first page. "Tell me what I'm looking at," she said. And I did. We sat there for 2 hours, going through every document, every protection my father had quietly built into the structure of her life. Not because she needed someone to explain it for her, because she'd earned the right to understand it fully, in her own time, with someone she trusted beside her. She filed for divorce 6 weeks later. Dennis contested it. The contest lasted 9 days before his attorney apparently advised him that litigation against a trust structure drawn up by a 31-year estate attorney, reviewed annually, and specifically amended to address exactly this scenario, was not a productive use of anyone's time or money. He signed. My mother read my father's letter for the first time on a Sunday morning, sitting in the small chair by the window that had always been hers. I made coffee and stayed in the kitchen, close enough if she needed me, far enough to give her the privacy the moment required. When she came back to the kitchen, her eyes were red but her posture was straight. She set the letter on the counter carefully, smoothed it flat with her palm. "He knew I might be lonely," she said. "He wasn't angry about it. He just wanted to make sure that whoever you chose, they couldn't choose your money for you." She looked out the window for a long moment. "He was always 3 steps ahead," she said softly. "Even from a distance." "Even now," I agreed. The condominium felt like hers again after that. Small shifts you wouldn't notice unless you'd been watching. She rearranged a few things, put a photograph of my father back on the bookshelf that had been moved to a drawer, started cooking the Sunday dinners she'd stopped making because Dennis had preferred restaurants. The last message I received from Dennis came through a mutual acquaintance, a clumsy 3-sentence attempt to imply that I had manipulated the situation, that my mother had been given an incomplete picture, that he intended to make things difficult. I forwarded it to my attorney. Then I blocked the number, added the message to the file I'd already handed over, and went back to the merger filing that had been waiting on my desk. My father once told me that the law, at its best, is not about winning. It's about clarity. About making sure that when something matters, there is no ambiguity about who it belongs to and why. He spent his career giving other people that clarity. And then, quietly, without drama, without a single raised voice or tearful confrontation, he gave it to us. If any part of this feels familiar to you, if you've ever watched someone you love slowly hand their voice to someone who hadn't earned it, if you've ever had to stay silent and patient while you waited for the moment the truth could actually be heard, you're not wrong to hold the line. You're not wrong to prepare before you act. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone you love is wait until they're ready to see what you already know. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever had to protect someone who didn't know they needed protecting? I want to hear your story. We share them here every day, stories about patience, about love that plans ahead, about finding your way back to yourself. Subscribe and stay with us. The next one is coming soon.